Let's talk about what the Canadian federal budget got right, what they got wrong, but more importantly, what it means for Canadians both now and in the future. What's up everyone, Conrad Neufeld here, and today we're talking about the Canadian federal budget. And there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of people already tearing this thing apart. But it's not all bad. It's mostly bad, in fact, some of it's actually downright terrifying, but it's not all bad. I mean, let's quickly look at the last 20 years leading up to this budget, because I do believe context is important. I have mentioned many times before that it is no secret that this federal government just isn't good with money. They weren't good during the good economic times, and they were even worse during the bad economic times. From 2000 to 2008, Canada was enjoying not only a balanced budget, but a surplus. Economically, we had a lot of good things going for us. Of course, as we know, came the housing crash of 2008 that spilled into 2009. And to battle against that Great Recession, by 2010, that surplus was gone, and we were in the hole for the first time this century. At the time, though, while he wasn't the most popular, we did have some very strong leadership, at least economically, at the helm, despite his faults. And amazingly, and I don't use that word lightly in this context, during a troubling time for not only the world, but for Canada as well, we were able to balance the budget in just a short period of time. And honestly, there are far too many Canadians that don't grasp just how significant that was. What should have continued was a year-over-year positive trend upward so that Canada was back into surplus territory. In fact, had that happened, we would have been in a much better position financially to respond to the pandemic, instead of making decisions out of desperation. What happened instead is Canada got a new government and we began racking up debt. Worse yet, it was for no meaningful reason. So when the bad times eventually did hit with the pandemic, Canada had no savings to react, and as a result, we ended up with this.
And the budget will balance itself.
It's not hard to see why so many Canadians and stakeholders and investors in Canada are looking at this budget and saying to themselves, we are in for a rough 10 years, maybe even longer. Financially, the track record of this particular government is not good. They've missed their targets every single year since they've been in office. I mean, even when I look at how they intend to reduce the deficit to $31 billion by 2026, the first thing that comes to my mind is, there is no way in hell that that's happening. If we even make it to a $75 billion deficit by 2026, I'll be shocked. We have never had a government that has spent nearly as much in the history of our country. In fact, during Trudeau's reign, he is now slated to spend more than every other prime minister in the history of all of Canada combined. That includes a Great Depression, multiple recessions, and a Great Recession. So now the real question is, we're spending a ton of money, so where is it all going? Let's start with what this budget did correctly, because it's a shorter list. The government did do a good job of acknowledging that this pandemic did not affect everyone universally and equally. In fact, some people, believe it or not, even thrived during this pandemic period. And while the economy is already recovering much faster than anticipated, it's resulted in a K-shaped, disproportionate recovery. There are Canadians that are doing well, and other Canadians that are doing not so well. So to take a portion of that budget and put it into rent subsidies, or wage subsidies, or even to bolster EI to help people get back onto their feet, these are all good things. Now, monitoring these programs to adequately make sure that people with nefarious intentions aren't taking advantage of these programs, that's an administrative nightmare. But it does come from a good place. Students and the elderly were also partial winners in this budget. The budget declared the government's promise to extend the interest forgiveness on federal student loans through to March of 2023. My hope is that students with these loans see this as a great opportunity to hammer down on those debts and get rid of them. My fear is that students are going to see this as an opportunity to have additional cash flow and spend it elsewhere. Hopefully that won't be the case. With seniors 75 years old and older, they will now be eligible for an increased payment for their old age security. These are people I think that could definitely use the money, particularly with how much groceries have gone up in the last couple of years. My only critique on this, though, is why stop at 75? I mean, with all of this money being spent, with such a small fraction of it being sent towards these seniors, why not extend the age to, 65 years old, where old age security starts? Why cap it off at 75? Perhaps almost comically, I'd say one of the things that they did best in this budget was in what they didn't do, and that was to have a knee-jerk reaction to these rise in housing prices that we're having currently. Now, you're going to have a lot of armchair economists out there disagree with me on this one. There's going to be people out there that are going to say, no, they should have rushed in with a bigger, heavier foot, that they should have proposed adjustments, and I just simply think that's wrong. The problem, as I've mentioned in some of my other videos regarding housing prices, is about the supply. And to that end, this budget only allocated a tiny $2.5 billion to be spent over 7 years on a number of affordable housing initiatives. So in this case, they're actually addressing the real problem, which is great. Will it be enough? Only time will tell. As I mentioned in my What to Do When You Think There Is a Housing Bubble video, right now there is a surge in new developments rising to meet the supply shortage. And it's entirely possible that there could be an overbuild, or at least a temporary oversupply. Supply, after all, takes a while to show itself in the market. Having a delayed, dramatic increase in the supply coupled with short-term restrictions could actually exacerbate the volatility of the market. It's well known that when restrictions are announced, that buying activity peaks before the restrictions take effect, as buyers rush to get in before the changes. If that buyer's peak somehow showed up at the same time that the supply started to hit the market, that would have some very adverse effects on some markets. So as uncomfortable as these housing prices are, it's better just to let the market sort it all out. After all, in large part, these problems were caused by the government, on the federal, provincial, and municipal levels. In other words, the problem was created by government. The solution isn't more government. Now, it's probably even more scary than the enormous amount of money that's slated to be spent is the comical fashion in which they think they're going to generate profits in order to pay it back. Take, for example, the new vacancy tax. This is a 1% tax targeting non-resident, non-Canadian owned residential real estate considered to be vacant or underused. And this won't come into effect until the new year. First of all, they claim it's going to bring in over $700 million over the next 4 years. No, it won't. The 1% tax they're trying to impose significantly increases the holding cost of these properties. So whoever's holding them is either going to fill them so that they're not being taxed with this tax, or they're going to liquidate that asset to find some other means of storing their money. Ironically, the budget doesn't seem to account for the very change in behavior that they're trying to promote. It's like they think they can charge the tax and people are just going to do nothing at all. On top of that, it's going to be an administrative nightmare to track down these units and then charge these people their tax, let alone collect that tax. So this program will at best break even, not generate the profit that they're looking for. Second of all, you're talking about a fraction of 1% of homes out there that are owned by non-residents, non-Canadians, and are currently sitting vacant. I mean, it's a small number. In fact, it's so small that even though I'm generally for this type of tax, it's going to have little to no impact in the long run. But hey, it makes a great headline, and all odds are saying that they're aiming for an election this fall. And following in line with that, let's talk about this stupid luxury tax. There's a saying I think most of us know well, or at least a variation of it. It's a quote from George Santayana. "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The states already tried a luxury tax in 1991. There was a tax on boats priced over $100,000, aircraft over $250,000, cars over $30,000, etc. Does that sound familiar? Do you know what happened? The luxury goods sector that manufactured those products got hit so hard that American middle-class working folks lost their jobs as the rich decided not to buy new boats and planes and cars. Go figure, the rich didn't want to pay an unnecessary tax. Not only that, when they did decide to make those purchases, they just did it elsewhere. They would buy that boat in Europe and just keep it at their second home or their villa on the coast of Europe. Then on top of that, Congress thought they were going to bring in $9 billion in revenue from this new luxury tax, just like Trudeau thinks he's going to bring in $604 million. What happened instead is that Congress quietly had to wind down the luxury tax program. The purchase of luxury goods shrunk so much in such a short period of time that not only were there so many jobs lost, but the very revenue that they were looking to create simply didn't exist. There was nothing left to tax. The problem with this whole Robinhood infatuation that this particular government seems to have, this whole take from the rich and give to the poor, is that it doesn't play out in real life how they have it imagined in their heads. There are ways to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor in a fair and equitable manner. This is not one of them. Then next in line, Freeland wants to take a stab at digital services with a digital services tax. So any of these web giants who rely on Canadian content, which is all of them because they're generally required to support Canadian content in order to do business here, are now going to get hit with this new digital services tax. And what's going to happen is these large giant companies are going to sacrifice their profits and willingly pay this tax out of their own pockets. Just kidding. Obviously, those companies are going to pass that tax on to you. They're a service, not a charity. So expect your digital services to rise in price while the government stands tall and heroically claims that they took on the big guys. And probably one of the most ill-conceived parts of this whole spending plan, and I mean, there's a lot, I could make a whole separate video just to cover the rest, is their $30 billion plan involving childcare. They claim by the end of 2022, the government is aiming to achieve a 50% reduction in average fees for regulated early learning and childcare to make it more affordable for families. These targets would apply everywhere outside of Quebec, where prices are already affordable through its well-established system. That is the most underthought plan I think I have ever seen. In fact, I could probably make a video on this one thing just entirely by itself. A one-size-fits-all is a marvelous idea for a program that big, covering so many unique and diverse provinces. Quebec's system works because they're heavily supported by the majority of Canada. Quebec alone receives 62% of the $19 billion of the federal program fund. Of course they can afford their childcare, everyone else is paying for it. They get $12 billion from the other provinces every year, and since 1957 have received over $250 billion in federal support. Most of that from other provinces. So if the other provinces are paying for Quebec's childcare, who's going to be paying for the other provinces' childcare this year? Or how about next year? Or how about the next 5 years after that? How does it become sustainable? You know who's paying for it? The answer is me and you. The only problem is we're already out of billions to give.